power is not just about how many people you can move, but it's also about how they move.
I'm here off of Lake Street, just a couple blocks from Mercado Central, a thriving marketplace fostering economic development for businesses in the Latino community here in Minneapolis. How can you create value for the communities that you're part of while also moving toward Drawdown? Today I'm talking with Jose Alvillar, who's a community organizer with Unidos Minnesota, connecting people in the community with services that are part of the climate solution.
My name is Jose Alvillar, he, him, his. I'm an organizer with Unidos Minnesota. I've been here like roughly 5 years. I'm originally from Mexico, specifically Puebla, and I came to the US maybe when I was roughly 4 years old. As a kid, I was always instilled by my grandma, like to be proud of my traditions and my roots and where I came from. I'm actually Porchteca and Otomi, which are indigenous people from Puebla. And so my grandma is actually one of the very few people in our hometown that still speaks Nahuatl, which is the native language up there. And so I grew up understanding like who I am and what my place was in the world. And so I feel like I still like hold on to that. Like, and also my dad is a chief. We've been in the dance community, Aztec dance community for 4 generations now. And so that's why it's so important to me, because it's a way that I still connect to who I am. I'm actually now a dance chief. With that comes to a huge responsibility of like knowing basically all the dances, knowing how to drum them, knowing how to like do our healing practices and spirituality around our fire chalice and how we connect to the world. But I love it. And I don't know, it just also reminds me of my community, and it reminds me of my grandma, like who was my biggest influence on reconnecting with my roots. And it's actually connected to the type of organizing that I do, which is education, climate, and immigration. But one of the biggest campaigns that I'm working on right now is ethnic studies, which talks a lot about learning to love ourselves once again, to like have that self-love and self-identity and reclaiming that. Because our education system and the racialized capitalist system that we live in continue to tell us that we're not enough.
What did you want to be when you were growing up?
I was instilled that I needed to be like an architect. I went to Augsburg College, now Augsburg University, but I majored in studio arts, philosophy, and architecture. It also became a passion of like, what can I do if I become an architect for our community? And like, it's something that I wanted to do. But then I enrolled into the University of Minnesota, applied to their master's program for architecture, and I realized that I didn't qualify because I was undocumented. That same year though, DACA became a thing. I applied, I got my work authorization card, but I was still in this limbo of like, I can't really pursue architecture. And so then I was like, okay, what can I qualify for? And I ended up getting a job at Minneapolis Public Schools. Started working with youth and students that looked a lot like myself, were either undocumented, were Spanish speakers. And I realized that was so fulfilling and it felt purposeful. And that's also when I found out, oh, our education system is messed up. And that as much as I try to support them, it was still not enough because systemically and structurally, there were no changes. And at that point, I actually quit and said, I can't do this anymore. I want to change something. Like I want to change the systems, not just for myself. I also want to change the system for my students because I saw myself reflected in them that I also had a really bad experience because the education system would tell me that I did not exist. I actually remember having a conversation back in high school with my history teacher, and we were talking about the Aztecs. And I told her like, oh, this is how my dad dresses. He's a chief. Like it's 4 generations in my family. And her comment was like, what are you talking about? Like, stop lying. Like, Aztecs don't exist anymore. And I believed it.
Wow.
Like, because to me, she's a teacher in this position. How am I believing my dad, who doesn't have a title, even though he dresses in his regalia and things like that?
Yeah.
But in my mind, I believed that teacher, that she was the one that was right. And that deprived me from my identity. And it made me have shame almost, like, wow, have I been lying? Like, do my people actually don't exist? Like, what am I? And that's why I really wanted to change that system. And eventually, Unidos was hiring for an organizer, and it felt like that's what I want to do. And now I've been organizing for 5 years, and not only is this job fulfilling, but it's also like and purposeful. But I also truly believe that we can live very different lives if we truly get what we need. And we can live a thriving, dignified life for everyone, regardless of where we live, regardless of how we look like, regardless of our status, regardless of so many things. And when we get there, I'll be okay with not organizing anymore.
What is the work that you do in your role and here at Unidos?
We were formerly known as Navigate Minnesota, and then in 2017, I want to say, we decided to rebrand as Unidos Minnesota, and that's roughly around the same time that I started joining Unidos Minnesota. And ever since then, we've been a power building organization that organizes on education justice, environmental justice, democracy, and immigration justice. For me, growing up, undocumented and also with like immigration and now have DACA status, the system will quite literally tell me that I needed to live in the shadows, that I needed to hide, because otherwise immigration and things like that and the police. And for me, like doing organizing work is me contesting for power and really stepping into that and saying that I am deserving of this and that we all deserve dignified lives. Power is not just about how many people you can move, but it's also about how they move. And that's so real, because if you have people connected to a political home that are connected to a larger agenda and vision, that is so much more powerful than having people just go out and vote for different things. The power for us is when we're together.
There's like the personal benefit, but then there's also the community benefit in the work that you do. How is the work that you do a climate solution?
People are seeing that climate change is a real thing and that we are living in a climate crisis. And our community members were like, we want solar, but we don't know how to do that. And so our role has kind of been like to bridge that gap. We've actually partnered with an organization called CUB that has been one of our greatest partners. And one of the things that we've kind of collaborated on is like, how do we bring like education workshops to undocumented or better yet, Spanish-speaking communities, because a lot of their information is predominantly in English. And so we've partnered in that. And another very like super simple but very effective thing has been understanding our utility bills. Because there's so many community members that like, oh, I don't know whether they're charging me this and that.
Right.
And like simply just having a sense of like, oh, this is what this means. So that's kind of where we've been at, like on the ground level.
How do you like navigate the challenges that come with the work that you do?
One, like I have therapy, which is like super helpful. Two is, I would say like having that connection to the arts, to my culture, has been what regrounds me to like remind me of like why I'm doing this work. When I first got involved with our environmental justice work, like one, I saw it as a way of like regrounding myself to my ancestral roots of like, we have one earth, we have one place that we can call home. I saw that us as BIPOC folks, as Indigenous folks, we weren't really at the forefront of policy changes that were affecting us. The other thing was, I guess, my lived experience in reality as an undocumented person, that there's an intersection between education and immigration and climate and how they're woven together. Like, I came to Minnesota not by choice. It was because of political turmoil, because of US intervention, because of corporations in my hometown that were making our lives really hard to live because the lands literally weren't growing anymore. because corporations, they just dump everything there, and that affected us and affected my family. And then there's people who are like, this is not okay, we will fight for our land. And eventually, unfortunately, that led to the murder of my grandfather. And so my family had to escape because of that. And so I saw my involvement in that sense that I'm affected by it in a very different way and context. And that's why I wanted to do environmental justice work. And then the other part is like all these things that come rushing into my mind, especially when you just organize day in and day out. And I think that makes me feel like, oh, like the work that I'm doing is pointless. Like nothing that I'm doing is gonna change. But then I remind myself, that's exactly how they want me to feel. For me to stay in this place of powerlessness is what benefits them. And that in a way regrounds me of like, no, like I am not gonna concede power before I even decided to contest for it. And that brings me so much clarity. And granted, I work with other organizers that also tell me like, you can do this. You just have to step into the fray and step into it unapologetically and powerfully and demand these changes. And so that's another piece that like really regrounds me. Like remembering why this is happening, who it benefits, and what's my responsibility to do something about it.
Do you have advice that you'd give to your younger self?
One thing that I would like to tell my younger self is to let him know that I am deserving of living a public life, that I am deserving of love, that I am deserving to be seen, because as I mentioned, for a long portion of my life, I was told otherwise. And I think for me, like vividly, there's a moment in my life where that became so real, and I completely believed it, that I needed to like completely live in the shadows. When I was 4, when I was actually trying to cross the border, I was detained. And I was there with my sister who was 5 years old and my uncle who was 25. And we were detained probably for like a month or so. I had forgotten about that. And it wasn't until like publicly and all over the news, people were seeing like kids in cages. To me, that was in a way like re-traumatizing, and it reminded me of like what happened to me. But as I reflect on it and think about it, I wish I could tell my younger self, when he finally made it out of that place, that I was still deserving to live my life. And that, yes, what I went through was hard and traumatizing, but I don't know, I guess almost letting him know that he can still live an unapologetic, powerful life, regardless of what happened to him. My name is Jose Alvillar. I'm an organizer with Unidos Minnesota, and I'm helping the world reach Drawdown by organizing on environmental policy and systems change with the Latinx community.